On May 24, 1940, at precisely 11:42 hours, a single radio transmission from the Führer's headquarters would reshape the trajectory of the Second World War, with the cold efficiency of a blade severing an artery. The message was brief, clinical in its phrasing, devastating in its implications. Halt Order 1340-23. 3 words that would allow 338,226 Allied soldiers to escape across the English Channel, while simultaneously preserving the German war machine for its eventual turn eastward toward the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. This was not mercy. This was not strategic brilliance. This was calculation disguised as restraint, a decision that would echo through the corridors of history with the persistent rhythm of an unresolved chord, its consequences rippling forward through time like shockwaves from a detonation, whose full force would only be understood in retrospect. The Halt Order represents one of those singular moments when the machinery of war pauses, when the inexorable logic of conquest encounters the friction of human decision-making, and when the future pivots on the axis of a single choice made in a room thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of empire. To understand this moment is to glimpse the mechanical heart of warfare itself, how resources flow, how priorities shift, and how the preservation of military assets for one campaign can determine the fate of another. The spring of 1940 had unfolded with the terrible precision of a clockwork mechanism designed by minds that understood both the poetry and mathematics of destruction. France was collapsing with a speed that astonished even the Germans themselves, her armies retreating in disorder, her government preparing for capitulation, her people watching their world dissolve with the helpless fascination of witnesses to an avalanche. The Maginot Line, that monument to defensive thinking and concrete confidence, had been outflanked by armoured columns that moved through the Ardennes forest like mechanical wolves, exploiting the gap between French strategic assumptions and battlefield reality, with the ruthless efficiency that would define modern warfare. The speed of the German advance had created its own form of strategic vertigo. In 18 days, Wehrmacht forces had accomplished what the Kaiser's armies had failed to achieve in 4 years of grinding attrition. The breakthrough at Sedan on May 13 had torn open the Allied front like a scalpel cutting through tissue. Within 48 hours, German armour was racing across northern France, severing communication lines, disrupting supply networks, and transforming organised defence into chaotic retreat. The British Expeditionary Force, along with remnants of French and Belgian units, had been compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the port city of Dunkirk, a coastal enclave that had become, through the logic of retreat and the geography of defeat, the last hope for preserving the trained core of Britain's land forces. These were not just soldiers, they were the institutional memory of an army, the accumulated expertise of peacetime training and early wartime experience, the human infrastructure upon which any future resistance would depend. Among them were officers who had studied at Sandhurst and St. Cyr, sergeants who understood the mechanics of modern warfare, specialists in communications, logistics and engineering, whose knowledge represented decades of institutional investment. The composition of the trapped forces revealed the full scope of what was at stake. The BEF included not merely infantry divisions, but the technical specialists who operated radar systems, the signals officers who coordinated radio networks, the artillery specialists who understood counter-battery fire, the engineers who could construct airfields and fortifications under combat conditions. These men represented the nervous system of a modern army, not easily replaced, impossible to replicate quickly, essential for any future military operations. General Heinz Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps had advanced with the relentless efficiency that had become the hallmark of German armoured warfare, their tanks churning through the French countryside like steel predators following scent trails of diesel fuel and cordite. The Panzer III and Panzer IV vehicles that formed the backbone of German armour were not necessarily superior to their French counterparts in terms of individual specifications. Indeed, the French Char B1 possessed heavier armour and more powerful guns, but they operated within a tactical framework that maximised their collective effectiveness through coordinated movement, integrated communication systems, and aggressive exploitation of breakthrough opportunities. Behind the armoured spearheads, the infantry divisions followed in trucks and on foot, consolidating gains, securing prisoners, transforming tactical victories into strategic reality. The entire mechanism of blitzkrieg was functioning with textbook precision, combined arms coordination that integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a unified system of destruction, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs that prevented enemy forces from establishing defensive lines, systematic disruption of enemy command and control systems that created organizational paralysis, more devastating than physical destruction. The German advance had created what military theorists would later recognize as a perfect example of operational art. The level of warfare that exists between tactics and strategy, concerned with the movement and employment of large formations across extended distances and timeframes. Guderian's corps had not merely won individual battles, but had transformed the entire operational environment, creating conditions where French strategic reserves could not reach threatened sectors, where communication between higher headquarters and frontline units became impossible, where the tempo of operations exceeded the enemy's capacity for coordinated response. By May 23, Guderian's spearheads were within artillery range of Dunkirk's beaches. The pocket was sealed, the trap was closing. German reconnaissance units could observe through binoculars the crowds of Allied soldiers gathering on the waterfront, the improvised defensive positions being constructed from whatever materials could be found, the desperate attempts to establish some form of organized perimeter around the last French port, still in Allied hands. And in that moment of apparent triumph, when the destruction of Britain's land forces seemed inevitable, when the complete elimination of organized resistance in Western Europe appeared to be a matter of hours rather than days, Hitler chose to pause. The Halt Order did not emerge from a single conversation or a moment of individual inspiration, but from the complex institutional machinery of the German High Command, a bureaucratic ecosystem, where competing agencies, personalities, and strategic visions intersected in ways that often produced unexpected outcomes. Understanding the decision requires mapping this institutional landscape, identifying the pressure points where different organizational cultures came into contact, and recognizing how systemic factors shaped individual choices in ways that no participant fully comprehended. At the apex of this system stood Adolf Hitler himself, a figure whose strategic vision combined genuine insight with catastrophic blind spots, whose understanding of operational warfare was both intuitive and dangerously incomplete. Hitler possessed a remarkable grasp of political psychology and strategic timing, but his comprehension of military logistics and tactical coordination remained fundamentally amateur. This combination of strategic intelligence and tactical ignorance would prove decisive at Dunkirk, enabling a decision that was strategically rational while being tactically questionable. The Oberkommando des Heeres under General Franz Halder represented the institutional memory of the German officer corps, professionally trained, strategically conservative, operationally competent. These were men who understood the mathematics of modern warfare, who could calculate supply requirements and maintenance schedules with precision, who recognized the difference between tactical opportunity and strategic necessity. Their influence on the Halt Order reflected not personal ambition, but professional judgment about the limits of armored operations and the requirements of future campaigns. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe constituted a third center of institutional power, an organization that combined technological sophistication with bureaucratic ambition, genuine military capability with unrealistic strategic expectations. The Luftwaffe's advocacy for completing the Dunkirk operation through air power alone reflected both the service's confidence in its own capabilities and its desire to claim primary credit for a decisive victory. This was institutional competition masquerading as strategic analysis, organizational politics expressed through operational preferences. The tension between these institutional perspectives created a decision-making environment where tactical considerations were filtered through bureaucratic interests, where strategic calculations were influenced by organizational rivalries, where the optimization of military effectiveness became entangled with the dynamics of political competition. The Halt Order emerged from this institutional matrix as a compromise that satisfied multiple constituencies while serving strategic purposes that none of them fully articulated. More fundamentally, the decision reflected the underlying tension between the immediate requirements of the Western campaign and the future demands of Eastern operations. German planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union had been developing in parallel with the offensive against France, creating a strategic context where tactical decisions in one theatre carried implications for operations in another. The preservation of armoured strength at Dunkirk served the institutional interests of those planning Operation Barbarossa, even as it conflicted with the immediate tactical objectives of those conducting the French campaign. This institutional complexity helps explain why the Halt Order appeared simultaneously rational and irrational, strategically coherent and tactically questionable. The decision emerged from the intersection of multiple organizational perspectives, each logical within its own frame of reference, each serving legitimate institutional interests, each contributing to an outcome that exceeded the analytical capacity of any single participant to fully comprehend or control. The decision did not emerge from a vacuum, but from the intersection of multiple pressures that had been building within the German High Command, like steam in a boiler approaching critical temperature. Each factor was logical in isolation. Together they created a matrix of considerations that would reshape the war's trajectory in ways that no single participant could fully comprehend. The Halt Order represented the crystallization of these competing pressures into a single decision that would echo through the remainder of the conflict with consequences that extended far beyond its immediate tactical implications. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had been arguing for weeks that air power alone could complete the destruction of the trapped Allied forces, that the prestige of his service demanded the opportunity to demonstrate its decisive capabilities without the interference of ground operations. This was not merely vanity speaking, though vanity certainly played its role, but a genuine belief in the transformative power of aerial warfare, supported by the recent successes of Stuka dive bombers against Polish fortifications and the apparent helplessness of enemy forces caught in the open without adequate air cover. The Luftwaffe's confidence was not entirely misplaced. German air superiority over the battlefield was overwhelming, and the concentrated masses of Allied soldiers on Dunkirk's beaches presented ideal targets for sustained aerial bombardment. Yet this aerial supremacy masked fundamental limitations that would only become apparent under operational stress. The Luftwaffe's inventory of heavy bombers remained limited, its precision bombing capabilities were still rudimentary, and its logistical infrastructure was optimized for supporting rapid ground advances rather than sustained independent operations. Moreover, the weather conditions over the English Channel during late May were frequently unfavorable for air operations, with cloud cover and visibility restrictions that would limit the effectiveness of bombing missions. The gap between Luftwaffe confidence and Luftwaffe capability would prove crucial in determining the evacuation's ultimate success. More significantly, the German armoured divisions had been operating at maximum intensity for 3 weeks, their mechanical components stressed beyond normal tolerances, their crews functioning on adrenaline and caffeine, their logistical tail stretched thin across the conquered territories of Belgium and northern France. Tank tracks needed replacement after hundreds of miles of movement across varied terrain, engines required maintenance after continuous operation under combat conditions, ammunition stores needed replenishment from supply depots that were often hundreds of miles behind the advancing spearheads. The machinery of war, for all its terrible efficiency, remained subject to the laws of physics and the limitations of human endurance. The maintenance requirements were not trivial concerns but fundamental constraints that shaped operational capability. A Panzer III required approximately 8 hours of maintenance for every 24 hours of operation. Track replacement typically demanded 4 to 6 hours of specialized labor. Engine overhauls could consume entire days when conducted under field conditions. These technical realities meant that the apparent invincibility of German armor was purchased at the cost of constant mechanical attention, that tactical supremacy required logistical sophistication, that the preservation of combat effectiveness demanded periodic operational pauses. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, had been expressing concerns about the exposed flanks of the armored spearheads, the vulnerability of extended supply lines, and the need for consolidation before the next phase of operations. These were the calculations of a professional soldier who understood that rapid advance, however spectacular, created its own forms of vulnerability, that speed purchased at the cost of logistical security could transform tactical triumph into strategic disaster. Rundstedt's concerns reflected the institutional memory of an officer corps that had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, that understood how extended lines of communication could become fatal weaknesses, that recognized the difference between tactical mobility and strategic sustainability. The supply situation was indeed precarious. German armored spearheads were operating at the end of logistical chains that stretched across hundreds of miles of recently conquered territory, dependent on road networks that were often congested with military traffic, vulnerable to air attack from bases in England, subject to disruption by scattered enemy forces operating behind German lines. Fuel consumption was enormous. A Panzer division required approximately 80,000 gallons of gasoline per day during active operations, and ammunition expenditure was similarly prodigious. The mathematics of logistics suggested that a pause for resupply and reorganization was not merely advisable but essential for maintaining operational effectiveness. But beneath these immediate tactical considerations lay a deeper strategic logic that would only become apparent in retrospect. Hitler was already contemplating the next phase of his grand design, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the acquisition of Lebensraum, the final settlement of accounts with Bolshevism that had been central to Nazi ideology from its inception. France was effectively defeated. Her government was negotiating surrender terms. Her armies were dissolved or captured. Britain, isolated on her island, posed no immediate threat to German continental dominance as long as her land forces could be neutralized. The preservation of armored strength for future operations began to outweigh the complete annihilation of enemy forces that were already strategically neutralized. This strategic calculus reflected Hitler's understanding of Germany's fundamental resource constraints. The German war economy was already operating at near maximum capacity. The military-industrial complex could replace losses but not easily expand production beyond existing levels. The pool of trained personnel was finite and not easily replenished. Under these conditions, the conservation of existing military assets took on strategic significance that transcended immediate tactical considerations. Every tank preserved at Dunkirk was a tank available for operations against the Soviet Union. Every experienced crew saved from unnecessary combat was a crew available for the Eastern Campaign. The economic dimension of this calculation was crucial, but often overlooked in traditional military histories. Germany's steel production, while substantial, was limited compared to the combined capacity of potential enemies. Her oil reserves were insufficient for sustained multi-theater operations. Her ability to replace sophisticated equipment was constrained by shortages of critical materials and skilled labor. The arithmetic of industrial warfare suggested that tactical economy, the careful husbanding of military resources, was essential for strategic success in a protracted conflict. Moreover, the Halt Order reflected Hitler's persistent belief that Britain could be induced to negotiate a separate peace if offered reasonable terms. This calculation was not entirely irrational. Influential figures within the British establishment had indeed advocated for accommodation with Germany, and the complete destruction of Britain's land forces might have strengthened these voices while weakening those who favoured continued resistance. The preservation of British military leadership while demonstrating German restraint might serve diplomatic purposes that pure military destruction could not achieve. The Halt Order went into effect on the morning of May 24, 1940, with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized German military administration. Armored units received their instructions through normal command channels. Tank engines fell silent along the perimeter of the Dunkirk pocket, and nearly 40,000 German soldiers who had been poised to deliver the final blow instead settled into defensive positions and waited. The silence that descended over the battlefield was profound. The absence of diesel engines, the cessation of track noise, the sudden stillness that followed weeks of mechanical thunder. This operational pause created a temporal anomaly in the rhythm of modern warfare, a moment when the inexorable logic of military conquest encountered the friction of strategic calculation. For the first time since the offensive began, German forces were not advancing, not exploiting tactical success, not converting momentum into territorial gain. The pause felt unnatural to soldiers who had been conditioned to aggressive movement, who understood that in armored warfare, hesitation could be fatal, that the maintenance of initiative required constant forward pressure. For 3 days, 72 hours that would echo through the remainder of the war, the German war machine deliberately restrained itself, while the Royal Navy improvised one of the most remarkable evacuation operations in military history. Admiral Bertram Ramsay's Operation Dynamo transformed fishing boats into warships, civilian vessels into transports, weekend sailors into naval heroes. The evacuation became a masterpiece of improvisation under extreme pressure, a demonstration of how organizational flexibility could compensate for material disadvantage, how institutional adaptability could overcome tactical inferiority. The improvised nature of the evacuation masked sophisticated logistical planning that had been developing since May 19, when the Admiralty first began considering the possibility of a large-scale withdrawal from French ports. Ramsay's staff had identified potential evacuation routes, catalogued available vessels, established communication networks with French port authorities, and developed contingency plans for different scenarios, ranging from partial withdrawal to complete evacuation. When the operation commenced, this preparatory work enabled rapid mobilization of resources that appeared chaotic but was actually carefully coordinated. The vessels that participated in the evacuation represented a cross-section of British maritime capability. Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers operating alongside Thames riverboats, cross-channel ferries, fishing trawlers, private yachts and commercial barges. The largest ships could transport hundreds of soldiers per trip, but were vulnerable to air attack and required deep water approaches. The smallest could navigate shallow waters and present difficult targets, but carried only dozens of men per voyage. The optimization of this mixed fleet required constant calculation of risk versus capacity, speed versus vulnerability, tactical flexibility versus operational efficiency. The numbers tell their own story with mathematical precision. 338,226 men evacuated between May 26 and June 4, including 139,197 French soldiers who would reform as the core of the Free French forces. These were not just statistics, but the preserved human capital of resistance, trained officers who would plan D-Day, experienced sergeants who would train new recruits, specialists in communications, engineering and logistics, who would prove irreplaceable in the years ahead. The evacuation preserved not merely individual soldiers, but the institutional memory of modern armies, the accumulated expertise that could not be quickly replaced or easily replicated. Among the evacuated personnel were 3,500 officers of various ranks, including brigade and divisional commanders who possessed irreplaceable experience in coordinating large-scale military operations. The preservation of this command structure meant that Britain retained the institutional framework necessary for rebuilding her land forces, the human infrastructure required for training new divisions, the tactical knowledge essential for developing improved doctrine and equipment. Without these officers, the reconstruction of British military capability would have required years rather than months. The technical specialists evacuated from Dunkirk represented an even more critical strategic asset. These included radar operators who understood the emerging science of electronic warfare, signals officers who could coordinate complex communication networks, artillery specialists who had mastered the mathematics of indirect fire, engineers who could construct airfields and fortifications under combat conditions. Their knowledge represented decades of institutional investment, technical expertise that was essential for modern military operations and impossible to replicate quickly. Meanwhile, the German armoured divisions used those same 3 days to conduct maintenance operations that would prove crucial for subsequent campaigns. Tank tracks were replaced across thousands of vehicles, engines overhauled by specialised maintenance crews, mechanical components inspected and repaired according to detailed technical schedules. The 1st, 2nd, 7th and 10th Panzer Divisions emerged from the Dunkirk period with their equipment refreshed and their organisational cohesion intact, precisely the assets that would spearhead Operation Barbarossa 13 months later. The maintenance operations were systematic and comprehensive, reflecting the German military's sophisticated understanding of mechanical warfare. Each Panzer Division maintained detailed records of vehicle operating hours, track wear, engine condition, and component replacement schedules. The pause at Dunkirk enabled maintenance crews to address accumulated wear that had developed during 3 weeks of intensive operations, to replace components that were approaching failure thresholds, to conduct preventive maintenance that would extend operational lifespans during future campaigns. The logistical implications of this maintenance pause were enormous. German supply columns that had been straining to keep pace with advancing armoured spearheads were able to establish proper depot operations, to consolidate scattered supply dumps, to reorganise transportation networks according to standard procedures rather than improvised arrangements. Ammunition stocks were replenished, fuel reserves restored, spare parts distributed according to projected requirements for subsequent operations. Most significantly, the tactical pause enabled German commanders to conduct after-action reviews, to analyse the lessons learned during the French campaign, to identify tactical innovations that could be incorporated into doctrine for future operations. These discussions would prove crucial in developing the tactical methods that characterised the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, improved coordination between armoured spearheads and infantry formations, refined techniques for exploiting breakthrough opportunities, enhanced procedures for maintaining logistical support during rapid advances. The irony was profound and would only become apparent with time. Hitler's decision to preserve his armoured strength by allowing the British evacuation would enable both the survival of Britain's military leadership and the optimal deployment of German forces against the Soviet Union. The Halt Order simultaneously strengthened both sides for the expanded conflict that was already taking shape in the Führer's imagination. creating the preconditions for a global war that would ultimately exceed Germany's capacity to sustain. The Dunkirk Halt Order represents a nearly perfect case study in the concept of strategic opportunity cost, the idea that every military decision involves trade-offs between competing objectives, that resources allocated to one purpose cannot simultaneously serve another, and that the optimization of force employment requires constant calculation of relative advantages and disadvantages across multiple theaters and timeframes. From a purely tactical perspective, the decision to halt the armoured advance appears almost incomprehensible. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped, demoralised, and largely defenceless against coordinated ground assault. The complete destruction of Britain's trained land forces would have eliminated any possibility of a cross-channel invasion for years, possibly decades. The psychological impact of such a catastrophe might well have forced Britain to negotiate a separate peace, removing Germany's last active enemy in Western Europe. Yet this tactical calculation fails to account for the broader strategic context within which Hitler was operating. By the spring of 1940, the Führer had already committed himself to the invasion of the Soviet Union, a campaign that would require every available tank, every trained crew, every logistical vehicle that Germany could deploy. The preservation of armoured strength for Operation Barbarossa began to outweigh the complete elimination of an enemy force that was already strategically neutralised. The mathematics become clearer when viewed through this lens. The British Expeditionary Force, however intact, could not threaten German continental dominance from its island base. The Soviet Union, by contrast, possessed the largest army in the world, vast territorial depth, enormous industrial capacity, and the ideological motivation that comes from defending one's homeland against foreign invasion. The resources required to eliminate the BEF completely might prove decisive in determining the outcome of the Eastern Campaign. Moreover, the Halt Order allowed German forces to demonstrate a form of restraint, but might encourage British willingness to negotiate a separate peace. Hitler consistently underestimated British determination to continue fighting alone, but his calculation was not entirely irrational. A negotiated settlement with Britain would free Germany's entire military apparatus for the Eastern Campaign, while eliminating the threat of a second front in Western Europe. The strategic logic of the Halt Order became manifest 13 months later, when German armoured spearheads crossed the Soviet frontier in the pre-dawn darkness of June 22, 1941. The same tank divisions that had paused at Dunkirk's perimeter now drove deep into Soviet territory, with mechanical precision that reflected both their technical superiority and their preserved organisational integrity. The 1st Panzer Division, which had spent 3 crucial days conducting maintenance operations while British soldiers waded through the surf at Dunkirk, would spearhead the advance toward Moscow, covering 450 miles in the first 18 days of Operation Barbarossa. The 2nd Panzer Division would lead the drive toward Leningrad, its equipment freshly overhauled, its crews rested and confident. The 7th Panzer Division, commanded by Erwin Rommel, would demonstrate the same tactical brilliance in the vastness of Russia that had characterized its performance in France. The preserved strength of German armoured forces enabled the most spectacular military advances in human history. Army Group Center advanced 400 miles in 2 weeks, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, destroying thousands of tanks and aircraft, penetrating to within sight of the Kremlin's spires. Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group South drove toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Yet the very success of the initial advance revealed the fundamental flaw in the strategic logic that had produced the Halt Order. The Soviet Union was not France. Its territory was too vast, its population too large, its industrial capacity too dispersed to be conquered through tactical brilliance alone. The preservation of German armoured strength had enabled spectacular tactical victories, but it could not overcome the basic mathematical reality that Germany lacked the resources to subjugate a continental empire. More significantly, the survival of British military leadership at Dunkirk ensured that Germany would indeed face the two-front war that had haunted German strategic planning since Bismarck. The officers who escaped across the Channel would plan and execute the D-Day landings, opening the second front that would ultimately prove decisive. The Dunkirk Halt Order illuminates the fundamental paradox of strategic decision-making in warfare, that short-term optimization often conflicts with long-term objectives, that the preservation of military assets for future operations can determine the outcome of conflicts that have not yet begun, and that the most rational calculations can produce results that confound the logic that inspired them. Hitler's decision to halt the armoured advance was not the product of strategic genius or tactical incompetence, but of a carefully reasoned calculation about resource allocation across multiple theatres and timeframes. The preservation of German armoured strength for the Eastern Campaign was a rational response to the strategic situation, as Hitler understood it in May 1940. The fact that this calculation ultimately proved flawed does not diminish its internal logic or its immediate tactical benefits. The broader lesson transcends the specific circumstances of 1940 and speaks to the enduring challenge of strategic planning in complex multi-theatre conflicts. Military resources are finite. Their employment in one operation precludes their use in another. The optimization of force deployment requires constant calculation of competing priorities and conflicting objectives. The Halt Order represents this dilemma in its purest form, a decision that achieved its immediate tactical objectives while creating the conditions for ultimate strategic failure. Understanding this paradox requires moving beyond simple narratives of error and insight to engage with the mechanical reality of military planning, the spreadsheets and logistics tables, the maintenance schedules and fuel consumption rates, the human factors and equipment limitations that constrain strategic choice. The Halt Order was not a moment of individual brilliance or failure, but the product of systematic calculation operating within constraints that no single decision could overcome. The Dunkirk evacuation and the Halt Order that enabled it created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, shaping the subsequent development of the war in ways that illuminate the interconnected nature of strategic decision-making. Each preserved British division would fight again, each maintained German tank would drive eastward, each decision about resource allocation would generate consequences that cascaded through time with the remorseless logic of cause and effect. The evacuated British forces provided the trained cadre around which new armies could be formed, their experience in France serving as institutional memory for the development of improved tactics, equipment, and organizational structures. Simultaneously, the preserved German armoured divisions would spearhead the initial phase of Operation Barbarossa with devastating effectiveness, their mechanical integrity maintained through the pause at Dunkirk, enabling the tactical brilliance that characterized the opening months of the Eastern Campaign. Yet this dual preservation contained the seeds of its own contradiction. The survival of British military leadership guaranteed that Germany would eventually face a second front in Western Europe, while the initial success of Operation Barbarossa drew German forces into a conflict that exceeded their logistical and industrial capacity to sustain. History offers few decisions that can be evaluated with mathematical precision, but the Dunkirk Halt Order comes closer than most to providing quantifiable data about strategic choice and its consequences. The evacuation saved 338,226 trained soldiers who would otherwise have been killed or captured. The maintenance pause restored the mechanical integrity of nearly 2,000 German armoured vehicles. The resource allocation enabled spectacular tactical success in the opening phase of the Eastern Campaign, while preserving the human capital necessary for eventual Allied victory. These numbers tell a story of optimization and trade-off, of tactical intelligence serving strategic purposes that contained their own internal contradictions. Hitler's calculation was precise within its parameters, but failed to account for variables that lay outside his analytical framework. The preservation of military assets for future operations was strategically sound. The assumption that these assets would prove sufficient for continental conquest was strategically flawed. Understanding the Halt Order requires engagement with the mechanical reality of warfare itself, how resources flow between competing priorities, how tactical decisions aggregate into strategic outcomes, how the preservation and employment of military assets operates according to laws that are simultaneously rational and paradoxical. The Dunkirk Halt Order endures in historical memory as a symbol of opportunity lost and gained, of tactical brilliance subverted by strategic miscalculation, of the way individual decisions can reshape the trajectory of global conflict. Its significance lies not in the moral judgments it invites, but in the analytical insights it provides about the nature of strategic choice under pressure. The machinery of war operates according to principles that are simultaneously logical and irrational, efficient and wasteful, precise and chaotic. The Halt Order captures this paradox in crystalline form, a decision that achieved its immediate objectives while creating the conditions for ultimate failure, that optimized tactical performance while subverting strategic purpose, that demonstrated both the power and the limitations of rational calculation under the pressure of global conflict. This is the final lesson of May 24, that strategic choice operates within constraints that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. that the optimization of military performance requires engagement with variables that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield, and that the preservation of military assets for future operations can determine not only the outcome of those operations but their ultimate strategic significance. Halt Order 1340-23. 3 words that changed the world, one calculation at a time.